to welcome everyone to our webinar today. The webinar is Memorials and Anniversaries Supporting Your Community. I first wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we all meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, today's webinar is being presented by Australian Red Cross, and our Red Cross recovery program is based upon the Australian Natural Disaster Recovery Principles and draws upon the Community Recovery Handbook, research from the Beyond Bushfires Research Program, as well as our own domestic and international experience. It also contributes to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction with a focus on building back better. Now, Red Cross has been supporting the recovery of rural, regional, urban and Indigenous communities, Australian communities post-disaster since 2006. Now, following the 2019-2020 bushfires, Red Cross is committed to a 3-year recovery program across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping topics, if I may. Today's session is being recorded for you, and once the event is complete, I'll share that information with you, and we welcome you to revisit the content and share it with your colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions, so please, you can probably see the Q&A box down there or the chat function. So if you just type in your question there, I can pose it to our guests if appropriate, or at the end of the session. But without further ado, though, I would like to introduce our speakers here. So Shona Whitton is the National Coordinator for Recovery and Psychosocial Support at the Australian Red Cross. Shona is responsible for the coordination and development of Red Cross's domestic disaster recovery and psychosocial programs. Now, prior to returning to Red Cross, Shona had worked as a consultant specialising in post-disaster recovery, psychosocial support, community resilience, including working as a field recovery specialist with the New South Wales State Government. Shona has a background with the Red Cross, where she worked on developing Red Cross's approach to disaster recovery programs and psychosocial interventions. In 2015, Shona was awarded the Winston Churchill Fellowship to explore approaches to temporary and permanent disaster memorialising in the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany and Norway. Shona has since provided technical advice to local and state governments and community services organisations in relation to the collective memorialising and psychosocial support at temporary memorials following a number of collective trauma events. Shona holds a Bachelor of Social Science and Psychology, a Master's in Community Development and Emergency Management, a Grad Cert in Gender Mainstreaming Policy and Analysis, and an International Diploma in Humanitarian Assistance. And she is currently undertaking postgraduate studies in psychology. We also welcome Karen Edmeades. Now, Karen is the Acting Emergency Services Manager for Red Cross in Western Australia. Karen has been working in the emergency services sector since 2002, working across preparedness, response and recovery. She's a self-confessed emergency management geek and completed her Masters of Emergency Management in 2015. But her connection to recovery truly began in 2011 when she worked with the Red Cross with the community after the Margaret River fires. Since then, she has held the preparedness and recovery role for Red Cross in Western Australia. She joined the Office of Emergency Management Recovery team for a year and returned to Red Cross as a Resilience and Recovery Coordinator and is, as I said, Acting State Manager for Western Australia. So Shona's going to begin, so please feel free, take it away, Shona.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks so much. And thanks for truly embarrassing Karen and myself with our CVs there, but a nice introduction for you all. Thank you. Just before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on today, the Gadigal people here on the northern beaches of Sydney. A couple of things that I like to start with before I kind of get going into the content. So I, as you'll see, kind of like to let photos do the talking when I present on memorials. Well, actually when I present on a lot of things, because I just think pictures often convey a lot more of the story than I can, and also I just am a visual person. I'll try to give you a bit of detail about the background to some of these images. They're not all mine, I confess, unfortunately. Much better photographers at play here than me. But I'll try to give you a bit of context, because I really believe that learning from other events is one of the best ways for us to kind of apply in our own contexts. And every community is different, so you'll take hopefully what you can and apply it in your own community today from Karen and myself. But things aren't the same everywhere. Another thing, I just also acknowledge that, my experience with memorials and anniversaries, temporary memorials, permanent memorialising, is very much from a Western perspective, and of predominantly sort of Western death and disaster ritual. Rituals are different across the world. I mean, we are common in the fact that we all ritualise in some way as human beings, but we certainly present a specific, well, not a specific, but a certain perspective in this session today. Also, as Jamie said, I have a psychology, sociology background, so I very much talk about people, communities, that kind of thing. And there are other aspects of memorialising that are more technical, might be built, design, that kind of thing, that we don't touch on as much. We're really talking about the people here today. And then lastly, just, and I imagine for Karen's portion of this afternoon as well, just to acknowledge that we will be discussing a variety of, and hearing from videos and experience with, in some cases, we'll kind of consider what that might, listening to and kind of experiencing some of this today, what that might do for us, particularly all, being in this COVID world, but also many of you from communities affected by the fires. So just to acknowledge that, it might be a bit distressing for some of you, but equally, I find some of these things kind of always a bit affecting. So I think one other thing, some of you may have come to a couple of my sessions on this before. Hopefully I don't repeat too much of the same stuff. Hopefully maybe there's a bit more new other stuff. Karen will also take over in a little bit when you are sick of hearing from me, and talk about her experiences at a local community level in WA. So I'm going to kind of stay kind of international, provide some Australian context, but kind of give you a broader kind of perspective, and then Karen will talk to some very real, well, they're all real experiences, but kind of more local context and her experiences in WA. So to get started, as I said, memorialising really, and anniversaries, permanent memorials, the kind of phenomenon of temporary memorialising, are all fundamental human behaviour across cultures and across, different countries. We all participate in some kind of death ritual and loss ritual as well. So, our kind of earliest ancestors, there's evidence that there was ritual around death and commemoration. And traumatic loss really kind of interrupts traditional practices. So you think about how, after people die, there's funerals and there's processes, and they differ in different cultures, but there's processes. And often we expect people to live long lives. And so early traumatic loss interrupts our kind of not only death practice, but what we expect to happen in the world. So they really kind of, impact on our understanding of life and communities and all that kind of stuff. And so they, these practices are really symbolic after that because of the kind of traumatic nature. This is a photo from Mexico from earlier in the year. Men, they're digging graves in a cemetery outside Mexico City for people that unfortunately died of COVID in Mexico. So, very elaborate kind of floral arrangements and things like that, which is similar to things that you see in Australia and other places. So, we can expect that there is this behaviour, kind of social community behaviour after disasters and other kinds of traumatic events. This is kind of expected, what we say is expected post-disaster behaviour, because really they're an extension of kind of fundamental experiences and practices of kind of, normal life. And, while these might be different across cultures, they're also different across communities. So the way in which we choose to grieve, the way in which we choose to commemorate and remember can be very different. And that's just a part of communities and life, really, that the way in which we choose to practice these things may have kind of local context. So, you know, for us as recovery workers or disaster workers, it's important to consider how we might make space for this, because the circumstances after disasters can be quite different. We talk a lot about kind of collective crisis when we're talking about disasters. So, and you know, other kind of traumatic events. So I like to start with this quote by a researcher and social worker from the US, Joshua Miller. If you have the brain space and time for some reading, Joshua Miller's work is a really great use of your time, I would say. He's a favourite of mine. So, you know, this idea for collective crisis, they kind of encompass any kind of crisis we experience as a group. So this is, you know, we experience as social groups, experience of shock, sadness, loss, horror, grief, all these kinds of things. Also, you know, positive emotions that some people feel after disasters, that feeling of kind of coming together can be a positive experience for some people. You know, and these experiences happen when there's something that, you know, like I was saying before, they, you know, these events kind of completely tear apart what we believe to be true about our communities, and often, you know, that is for some people the really traumatizing thing, that all of the things that, you know, we thought to be true, the assumptions that we had about the world are fundamentally altered by crisis events, and then they therefore, you know, can alter how we view the world, how we view our place in the world. So, you know, ultimately, collective kind of group memorialising or coming together at anniversary events can be part of kind of piecing some of those things back together. So that's, you know, I really like this quote from Joshua, you know, saying that these measures that we undertake, that we support to grow, can really help reconnect people with culture, what happened, the past, and kind of think about the way forward for people. So reconstructing that sense of belongingness in their community because things are now so different. And, you know, that for many of us as recovery workers, as I said, you know, this is really about how we can advocate for these kinds of collective rituals to occur. This photo here is from the downing of the Ethiopian Airlines flight 302 in 2018, you may remember. And so, I mean, one of the challenges though with collective crisis, one of the many, many challenges with any kind of disasters is, while communities have kind of communal experiences, we also all have individual experiences, and these can be wildly and wildly different. And so anniversaries and memorials, these, you know, and also day-to-day life often remind us of these sort of individual and community experiences. You know, anniversaries, as I'll talk a little bit about before, but they're really about that passage of time, and for everyone, what they feel around those times, the things that they recall about the particular event, because, you know, often anniversaries bring up memories of the day. You know, sometimes, as you know, they might be positive things, that coming together of the community, this support that people experience, and they want to kind of remember that particular point in time. But for many others, it might be memories of loss and pain and grief. And so those are the things that we have to consider when we're thinking about anniversary events. How do you balance the differing expectations and the differing experiences that people have about anniversaries and about the day itself, and how they want to participate in the day. This is a quote from Monica Eichen, who I met on my Churchill Fellowship. Her husband died on the 84th floor of the South Tower on 9/11. This is not her in the photo, although coincidentally it does look quite like her. And the photo is from the 9/11 memorial, if some of you have been there. This was earlier a couple of weeks ago, actually, on the anniversary, the 19th anniversary of this year. And an interesting anniversary, you can see someone wearing gloves there on the side and the lady wearing a face mask. COVID definitely impacted the memorial in New York this year. It's an interesting and fraught event. I think it is often, I will say, a interesting and fraught event, the 9/11 anniversary. If you're interested in kind of the ongoing challenges of anniversaries, it's worth a Google about this year and sort of a review of some of the kind of concerns and challenges around the anniversary. I hope I'm going to show you in a moment a video, and I'll just introduce it quickly. Hopefully I'll make it work. I couldn't embed it in my presentation, so I've got it open on the website. But so this here is Margaret Apsenall. She's the chair of the Hillsborough Family Support Group. Hillsborough, you may have heard of, was a stadium crush 31 years ago in England, and 96 people died in the crush. Margaret is the chair of the Family Support Group, who are family members and survivors of the event, and they for many years have organised anniversaries and other events, and also were very active in, if you know anything about Hillsborough, it was incredibly political, the fallout after Hillsborough. There was this is terrible event with a lot of blame based on blame placed on survivors and victims for causing the event, which was untrue, and there's been a lot of legal action to this day. But the 31st anniversary that Margaret talks a little bit about was earlier this year in April. And they were going to have their last ever memorial event at the football field. Unfortunately, COVID cancelled it, as it has many other things. But Margaret touches on a number of things we need to consider about memorials and anniversaries, and also it's an interesting insight into that these things carry on for a long time. So I'm just going to show this for you now. Hopefully you can see that. Can everyone see that? Just give me a yes in the chat box if you can, because I can't see you. Great, thanks Lara, thank you. All right, hopefully this works.
A big service at Anfield this year. It's going to be our very last service. We were hoping last year would have been the last service, but unfortunately, because of circumstances of a trial going on, we couldn't have it. But this year we were determined we will have the last service. So we are organising a service for the 15th of April, and I think it's important to say, that tickets will be available from Anfield from Wednesday, and the closing date will be the 31st of March, and that's for safety reasons, to get everything in order, ready for the service. This is a decision, that the families decided that to make it for everybody to hopefully move on. But, I think it's a good thing to have this for one last time, and also to have the opportunity to thank everybody for what they've done. They gave us the strength to carry on the fight. Without them, we couldn't have done nothing. When the families walked in and saw the crowds there, it meant a great deal to them. It gave us that uplift. It gave us the strength to carry on fighting, not just for ourselves, not just for the 96, but also for the survivors of that day. I've always said the service is not about remembering just the 96. It's also remember them survivors, those who are still suffering. I've had people in my office who've been genuinely really upset, and the guilt they still feel because they came home. And the only thing I can say to these people is them 96 and we as families can't thank you enough for coming home. I do remember saying to people, we are the voices, the eyes and the ears of them 96. Them survivors and those who gave evidence, if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't have got where we are today. So we owe a great debt to all of them also, because they were the voices of our 96.
You said it's obviously the last service, but what about the future for the group past that date?
The Hillsborough Family Support Group will not be in existence after this year. There's a trial coming up on the 20th of April, and after that trial, hopefully the group will be able to move on. 31 years is one hell of a long time for a group to have stayed together. But I think it's important now to try and have some sort of peace and enjoy what time we've got left Families are getting older now, and I can honestly say to have achieved so much, which we have achieved, they've got a lot to be proud of. I'm so proud of my city, I'm so proud of our fans, and I'm so proud of this club. But most importantly, I'm proud of the families for having the courage, the strength, the commitment, the loyalty. We've had a lot of disappointment over the years, but we've also had a lot of joy. And when I say joy, I'm talking about families meeting, getting together, because you're not alone. We've been fortunate enough to have each other. We've had each other for 30 odd years. Yeah, we've had a lot of disappointments, but we've also had a lot of good times as well.
Okay, hopefully you're back with my slides. I think, so Margaret touches on a lot of things that are kind of worth thinking about, I think, over the next few days, particularly, you know, the length of time that these types of events sit with people, a long, long time, and for many people, their entire lives. And, you know, so we see that, you know, these events are, oh, no slides. Sorry, let me just stop and reshare. How about now?
No,
yes.
You've still got the video.
Oh, it's just, there we go. Great, can see.
Great.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Little technical issue there. To be expected, I think, with these things always. So, as I was saying, you know, a couple of things out of that, I think, that are worth considering, particularly the anniversaries and memorials often take a long time. Memorials take a long time to plan and develop. I won't touch on that too much today, but something to consider if your communities are considering permanent memorials, that you know, they can be expected to last a long time. And also, you know, the importance of representation in decision making. And so family support groups, we see many in the UK, for reasons I won't get into, they've got some good disaster advocacy going on there that we don't have here in Australia, unfortunately. But family support groups can often be really involved in driving decision making around anniversaries and memorial processes, and can be really good groups to engage with if they exist, to really help enable consultation and voice in anniversary events, particularly when events are particularly high profile, like the Hillsborough event. So, you know, and something I think Margaret also touched on was that, you know, disasters are really important markers of time after disaster anniversaries, rather, are really important markers of time after disasters. You know, they can often challenge the expectations of where people feel they should be after the disaster. You know, that they should have moved on, that they should be in a new house, or their house should be a certain point finished, or they should have more life certainty. They shouldn't be thinking about the disaster all the time 3, 4, 5 years later. They shouldn't still be sad all the time. You know, so there are many, and that's just a selection of some expectations people feel they may be at. Often they also, dates trigger renewed interest in the disaster, so media coverage, which can be sometimes a good thing for communities, other times not at all. And these things aren't, you know, there's sort of no formula really for whether or not a community wants media or not. Sometimes events similar to Hillsborough, where there's ongoing legal issues and other kind of problems like that, media can be useful for communities to ensure that they have their voice heard in what's going on, and can be a real tool for community groups, particularly if they're more activist. But in some cases can be really also distressing for communities to have a lot of media, and particularly when people have died in the disaster. So these are all things to consider and to think about. From an individual perspective, it's important that people prepare for anniversaries psychologically, to think about how they might want to spend the day. Do they want to participate in formal events? Do they want to not participate in informal events? How the day might make people feel, and people will have different ways of coping with the event. Some people may want to be really involved in you know, planning the events, but not actually want to be there, and that's okay. And as Natalie's saying, would imagine that there is a risk of people seeing images of their own burnt homes in the media again. Yeah, definitely. And that would be really distressing for some people, or many people, I would say. You know, the kind of lack of ownership you have over imagery of your house, property, things, self. If you know, were interviewed at the time, people often don't consider at the time that, you know, that kind of stuff may get reused. That can be very distressing for people. So these are, you know, things to consider about anniversaries, really. You know, anniversaries and memorials are really, however, are really a good way for people to connect after crisis. They can create a place for people to come together. And we know that social connection and kind of people being together help us make sense of these kinds of events that kind of shock, horrify us, sadden us, and kind of, you know, social connection helps us normalize how we're feeling. Yes, and you know, people, as you're saying there, Candace, people will have different dates for the same disaster depending on what happens. So, and that will be extra challenging for the bushfires. If many of you, I imagine, are involved in last summer's bushfire recovery, there's, you know, we've had a couple of anniversaries already, and they go right through to February next year. So. Yeah, it's going to be really challenging, and but in a way also, you know, highlights that the more local events can be, the better, really, sometimes. So, you know, when things happen at one time, there's often a push for kind of big, huge, broader community events, which sometimes disempowers communities in the sense that. Yeah, so in Eurobadala there are 3 months of anniversaries. Wow, from end of November to February. Yeah, challenging time for everyone over summer, I think. So anniversaries, you know, can be, and different memorial events happen in many types of ways. So, you know, there are services earlier on in the recovery or earlier on after the disaster. You might see vigils and other kinds of events like that. Many of you will have participated in these types of events, and they're common. You know, the early anniversary events that we see are really common responses. You know, we see increased attendance at faith-based services and spiritual services, and even people who aren't directly impacted by the event will often be very involved in collective responses. Sometimes these are held at temporary memorials, which I'm not going to get into, but I could do a whole session on just temporary memorials. Or at permanent memorial sites. Interestingly, in a couple of places I visited on my Churchill Fellowship, cities or towns had kind of interim memorials. So they'd had a temporary memorial at a particular site, and then because the process of creating a permanent memorial was underway, but for anniversaries, the community still wanted somewhere for people to gather. So there was sort of like a interim semi-permanent type memorial that was sort of like a placeholder in a sense for something that would come later, you know, a bigger process of sort of some kind of designed thing or participatory type memorial or whatever they have planned, but there's a sort of interim thing. So there was one in Oslo in Norway, which is still there because there's there was quite a controversy over the Utoya Memorial in Norway. Also 9/11 had a interim kind of viewing platform where they held anniversary events for 10 years until the opening of the 9/11 memorial. So in some cases, you know, these things take a long time. So these sort of interim spaces are important to have places for people to gather. And, you know, something I think we've seen a lot this year is that following events that are highly political, or there's a early attribution of blame, or, you know, other kinds of challenges around what happened in the event, that collective responses can include protests, rallies, and these can intersect with temporary memorial sites or other kind of gathering places. So we've seen that a lot this year at the Black Lives Matter protests. But certainly similar things have happened as well after Christchurch, in the Christchurch shooting, was it last year, the year before, as well. So you kind of see things that maybe, and happened a lot in France after the shootings there. So these kind of may become more sort of, you know, marches and that kind of thing. So there's different ways in which people choose to commemorate and remember. And also these, you know, as I've said, these take a kind of variety of forms. So I should probably say this is from Thailand after the Indian Ocean tsunami. They had a formal memorial event in the January after the tsunami. They had 10,000 of these beautiful lanterns there. And then this, quite similarly, is sort of a very different type of memorial event after the death of Kobe Bryant, his daughter, in a helicopter crash earlier this year. So, you know, these types of events take very, very different forms, which is, you know, reflective of the communities themselves and the people who are affected by the disaster. So, you know, I think that's an interesting part of these things. Ultimately, you know, memorial events and anniversaries are really about loss. They're not always just about bereavement. So, you know, not only just about people having died, they can be about loss of what the community, of property, of pets, of animals, of the way in which the community was before, might be of historic places, community icons, that kind of thing. So in a sense, for anniversaries, there can be sometimes, well, you know, no one died, we don't have to really commemorate this, sometimes a bit of that. And I think it's important to remember that there are many kinds of loss, and anniversary events are important also to consider how we acknowledge those different types of loss in communities, and also that, you know, and our colleague Kate Brady has written part of her PhD was on hierarchy of affectedness. So this idea that you know, people have the people whose family members and loved ones died were the most affected, and then there's sort of like this tiered approach, and then obviously, and it's as black and white as that, and really it's not in reality. And you know, because when people die, they have large circles, so it's not just family members who are affected, but it's also friends, it's also you know, other people in the community that knew the person. So it's not just which is obvious, but also, you know, people who had perhaps more peripheral losses may have really profound effects on their lives that, you know, we can't really see from the outside, particularly around livelihood and things like that. So, you know, or our colleagues in our drought program have spoken a lot about, you know, farming communities where during the drought, farmers were, you know, hand rearing livestock and feeding livestock and having to deal with the death of their livestock when, you know, they'd formed these really close bonds with their animals, is really very confronting and very tragic for people. So, you know, these are things that we don't often quite think about So, and I think I've already touched on this a little bit, but, you know, memorials and anniversary events are kind of, in a way, they're not really interchangeable. Memorial is the place, but we often have anniversaries events at memorial sites, or if they exist yet. But anniversary events and memorials can often be about the dead, about people who've died. This is the 9/11 memorial. But they're really for the living. So we need to consider how people want to participate in the day. How you want people to behave at memorials is something that often isn't considered, but can be very offending and distressing for people if we don't consider what kind of space we want to create in these spaces, these places. I'll just go back quickly to this because this doesn't really tell you what it is. I just realised this is a memorial to books that were burned by the Nazis in Berlin, and so to me it's sort of this idea that memorials aren't always for people that have died. They can be for ideas. They can be about loss of different things, or it's not a great photo. I was on a walking tour. It was a bit hard to get a good photo without lots of people walking all over it. But it kind of is a void, and it kind of tries to convey that idea that they're empty bookshelves in the ground. So it's this idea that, the loss of ideas and all of that kind of created this void in the community and the culture, which I think is fascinating. Something also to consider if your anniversaries are as part of a kind of broader memorial process in your communities is that the process of developing permanent memorials or planning anniversary events is really as important as the end result, really, I think. And certainly that's something that when I spoke to people on my Churchill Fellowship and since, often for many people participating in the process can be a kind of healing or part of their healing process after the disaster. And so, this can take a really long time. Monica, whose quote I had earlier on, we spoke a lot when I interviewed her about being involved in a very, very contentious memorial process for the 9/11 memorial. She was on their committee. And it had a lot of different phases. First, they had to really fight for the space. Channel her energy and her distress, grief, but also to be around people who were having a similar experience, who'd lost loved ones as well, who had a really profound connection to the place as well. And so, and another woman I spoke to on my Churchill, Yelena, her brother died in 9/11. She said the same about the London memorial process, and that was a very different process, but again, being involved in it meant that she had this connection with other people who were having similar experiences, in this idea that not this idea, but this experience of supporting each other was sort of channeled through the creative process of being involved in the memorial, but also the kind of administrative stuff that kind of went on. So, as I kind of touched on a little bit, these processes can be led by different parties. So they can be government-led, community-led, family support group-led. This is the same for anniversaries. I think, anniversary events may be, groups may decide to do their own thing, or, they might be led by local government. There is, varying ways in which these may occur. I went along to, there's a community of practice many of you may be involved in, run by the Social Recovery Reference Group with Lou Mitchell. I wish I could see your faces because I imagine some of you are nodding, but I had an interesting conversation with a couple of people in a little breakout group around their experiences with memorials, and it was just really fascinating to hear about ways in which communities make collective decisions to memorialise or to have events or not. So, one person was sharing about their community had a particular crisis event, and for, they decided they'd memorialise on the first year and the 10th. That was it, every 10 years. And, and then in the years in between, different groups would do their own thing at the memorial. So there was a permanent memorial there. And so you can see that you know, these anniversary events, memorials, kind of pretty intertwined, and anniversary events might take place at the permanent memorial if there is one, or other important areas in your communities. So, you know, they may be pre-existing important locations in communities, or locations that have been made important by the event. So, you know, it might be where there was a recovery centre for a long time that was sort of community run, that may be sort of then now, you know, linked in with the event. Or it might be, you know, the community hall where people met all the time, or it might be the community hall that got rebuilt after the disasters. I know there's a community in New South Wales that are doing a lot of work to get a community hall rebuilt. So just lastly, I just want to, one of the kind of key things I think is really important, and I think Margaret in the video kind of touched on a little bit, well, as a representative of a family group, definitely, you know, talked about being the voice for people that were affected, but also, you know, an organised group. And so consultation with affected communities, and a broad consultation and inclusive. And what we mean by that is, often we only see that there's this certain affected groups, right? And that can be seen in a very kind of, not black and white, but sort of only people who lost their houses, or only people who lost loved ones. And that, you know, and sure, the next question is, well, you know, how broad's too broad? Like, what's broad enough? And that is a challenging question, because it will really depend on the community and your ability to be able to kind of do enough, do broad enough consultation. But I think the key here is to think wider than you probably already, than you may kind of, your fallback may be, I guess. So, you know, I think transparency is really important in processes. So being as open as you can about who you're talking to, who's involved, that kind of thing. I mean, these processes can be for anniversary events, developing permanent memorials, you know, dismantling temporary memorials. They can be very controversial. People will have very different ideas, and so they'll have different ideas about what they think is appropriate, about what should happen, and, you know, I'm sure Karen will share some different examples of things that have happened. But you know, every memorial is wildly different, and while anniversary events often can follow a bit of a, you know, there'll be a few speeches, there might be, if there's deaths, people might talk about the people who died, or read names or things like that, and then there may be some kind of other creative thing or whatever. So, you know, and then it's really about people getting together and talking, and barbecues and tea and that kind of thing. So they sometimes have a flow. They might be religious, they might not be religious, but all of these things, every little piece of it, they're symbolic, and people will have opinions. And so you need to be ready for the opinions if this is something that you're involved in leading or I suppose supporting. So, you know, I think that's something to consider, and how you might manage that consultation, and how you might kind of ensure that it's really broad and inclusive. A couple of things that you may find useful in this journey, I guess. So we wrote some guidelines around psychosocial guidelines around temporary memorial management. I know that's not probably what you're do, like anniversaries aren't temporary memorials, obviously, but there's some principles in there that I think are very can translate really well to anniversary events. So we talk about being inclusive, planning, you know, consulting, that kind of thing. So there's some useful, and we can share these slides because I've linked to where you can find all these. If not, just like Google those things, you'll find them. The other thing, communicating and recovery, is a resource that we have. We also have a training as well with it, but it's useful in terms of considering how you might target your consultation piece around anniversaries and memorials. So there's some useful tools in both the communicating and recovery guide, but also the training. And so if you want to kind of consider how you might target broader groups, or engage, do some consultation around what you want to do. I'm sure many of you are very experienced in this, but in a disaster setting, these things may be useful. And finally, my Churchill report, that if you've got some time, it's not too hard to read, you may be interested in having a look at. There's my email address. Feel free to give me, drop me an email if you've got any questions. I'm going to hand over to Karen, but first I just, Barbara's, she's put it to everyone, so I might just leave you all to read Barbara's great comment there about some positive experiences in her community, which is great. Thanks, Karen. Over to you. And we'll take questions at the end. So if you've got questions, we'll chat at the end.
Okay, can everybody see my screen? Thumbs up, Shona. Beautiful. All right, so I'd also like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which I'm working today, which is the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in WA, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Shona mentioned, I have had a bit of experience working with local communities here in WA, and have been on a variety of planning committees, recovery coordination groups, etc., both in metropolitan and regional settings. And so I thought that we could potentially share some of those practical aspects of supporting communities through this process. And there's certainly no easy answers on what these events and memorials should look like, and they're certainly as diverse as the communities within which we live, and extremely challenging to coordinate. So I'd like to start firstly by sharing a video with a community development worker that I worked with in the Shire of Harvey. She supported the community after the Yarloop bushfires in 2015. Not sure whether you heard about it over there in the east, but the Yarloop bushfires resulted in the unfortunate death of 2 community members, and pretty much the destruction of most homes and infrastructure in a small town. And so there was also significant impacts to neighbouring communities and farmers across the region. And so Marie here, 30 years experience in community development, was left with the task of managing the anniversary event for that. So just a couple of minutes of words on how she found that experience. That did not work. Okay. Let's try again. Beautiful.
Hey, Karen, we can't hear the audio.
Fabulous. I thought that might, I was watching the little messages going up and thinking there's a problem with the sound.
Maybe just try resharing, like, and clicking the thing.
Just let me go back first. So sorry about this.
The acknowledgement that happened.
There she is. I can hear her now.
You can hear her now? Beautiful. Yep. Okay, we'll start again. Sorry about that, everybody.
That's it. Thanks.
The first anniversary, if I can kick back to that, that was a hard one. That was really tough, the first anniversary of the fires. And people chose to, I guess, acknowledge that and go through that in different ways. But we had, as the community development team and as the Shire of Harvey, we had to lead the event, the acknowledgement that happened out at Yarloop. Yarloop was the chosen place to do it. On the oval where people sheltered from the fire. That was the hardest event I think I've ever organised or been a part of, because there were so many emotions involved and so many people, so many differences of opinion, but I think we pulled it off fairly well with the help of a lot of good people and with the team, the recovery team, which was made up of a lot of different organisations, including Red Cross. Yeah, so yeah, that's some of the. It's not just the infrastructure that we're rebuilding. We're trying to rebuild people's lives and their community. Yeah.
Okay, so Marie definitely points there to the challenging nature of anniversaries, and I think somebody with that degree of experience working in community development, finding it the hardest thing that they've ever done in their career, sort of points to those challenges. And certainly it can be very difficult for recovery workers to balance all of those different views and personalities that are involved in this process. So I've thought about the fact that there are a couple of lenses that we can utilise to frame and support our thinking around these events. And I think the National Recovery Principles are a great way to think about how we engage with our communities in these settings of anniversaries and memorials. So obviously recognising that each community has their local priorities and their knowledge, history, values and so on that will really influence how these milestones are acknowledged, and considering that the impact of this will extend far beyond that geographic community, as Shona mentioned. Utilising community-led approaches to ensure that the community is really the voice that is guiding this. It can be very easy as recovery workers to think about it and think, this will be a great event and this will show a lot of different aspects of the emergency. But if it's not really driven by your community, it tends to fall a little flat, and can, because it is such an emotive space, it really is one of those times where that community-led aspect is very, very important. It's also really important to coordinate these activities. It's not uncommon for multiple events or small gatherings to be occurring at the same time or over the same period, led by different groups. And I think as a coordination agency or support for our communities, we can really help in that coordination space, making sure that the events don't detract from one another, and as much as possible we're not duplicating effort of our communities and the people who are already under the pressure of recovering from an emergency. Communication is absolutely key, both before and after and during the event. So prior to an event, it's really important to ensure that your community is aware of the event, to make sure that people have an opportunity to engage in two-way feedback kind of loop is really valuable, so that you don't get to the end of an anniversary event and have a lot of people feeling like they didn't have an opportunity to participate or put their views forward. It's also important to provide some communication, particularly around wellbeing and mental health, and the fact that these events can actually bring up a lot of emotions for people, and to try and prepare your community for that. And lastly, to recognise and build capacity in your local community, understanding whether there are or not, given the context within which you're working and the level of capacity in your community. It may be that people are just too fatigued or too overwhelmed by the amount that they are doing in the recovery to really have an active role to play in the anniversary event itself, but they may want to contribute ideas and so on. So ensuring that people are able to contribute to the extent to which they are able in the current context is really important. So once again, those national disaster recovery principles are quite helpful just to think about how you are framing your anniversary event. And the second lens that I think is quite helpful are the principles of psychosocial support. And Red Cross is obviously a strong advocate of these principles. And I think that they can be very helpful in ensuring at the very least that the event that you run or the memorial process that you go through does no harm to your community, and with any luck supports their positive recovery outcomes. So ensuring that that a sense of hope is promoted through your event is really important. around sharing some positive aspects of recovery, what's changed, what's improved, and really focusing on the strengths of the community rather than potentially the struggles and the negative aspects of that. Obviously, you're not instilling false hope. It's got to be very realistic and a real reflection of what's happening in the community, but look for those positive examples to really show people that they've come a long way and things are progressing somewhat. Promoting a sense of safety, both in the physical nature of the event, ensuring that it's a safe environment, but also from a wellbeing or psychosocial perspective. For example, something simple like sharing photos or artwork as part of an event. If there's some graphic images in there, if you can provide some warning to community that those are in the art exhibition and that they can choose whether or not they want to be exposed to that and to potentially get triggered by those images. And that's particularly important if you have children that are going to be attending events. So just thinking about making sure that you've covered off on those supportive ways to make sure that people are attending in what they hope is a safe environment, even if it's just a matter of making sure they're informed enough to know what they are participating in. Promoting a sense of calm can be achieved by acknowledging the impacts of the emergency honestly and not sugarcoating what has occurred to that community, but also allowing people the time and space to really acknowledge and deal with those emotions that the anniversary or memorial may instill in them. Making sure that there is support around if people do become distressed, that they are, have some support that can calm them in the situation. And as much as possible, if you can encourage the avoidance of sensationalising the events, particularly the media, that really does support that sense of calmness around the event. Obviously, the social connection is a really important aspect of anniversaries, and it's very important principle of the psychosocial support aspect, ensuring that people can connect, and particularly those who may not have a good source of social connections in their everyday life. The memorial or the anniversary can really provide a focal point where they can actually engage in having a supportive, connected environment that they may not usually have at their fingertips. And lastly, self-efficacy, which is once again focusing on that community-led approach, making sure that we as much as possible empower our communities to really support their own emergency events and anniversary support so that they are really okay. So obviously the purpose of anniversaries is incredibly varied, and certainly not all of these aspects of anniversaries will always shine through, but certainly one thing that I think is common is that real need for people to share their stories and for survivors to reconnect and share their experiences, not only of the emergency event, but also what's happened in the time between when the event happened and what's happened in their lives since then. And certainly there's a lot of learning that can happen in that sharing of stories. It's also a really great way to share with the wider community or even the country that there are progress that has happened in those communities, but there's also continuing needs and struggles that the community sometimes wants to have acknowledged beyond their small communities. Anniversaries also function to locate and reinforce the disaster in the community's narrative as part of their social history and their identity. And that's certainly true for those memorials, particularly permanent memorials, which can really focus the attention on those events. They also work as a vehicle to thank and acknowledge the efforts of volunteers and others who have supported the community, whether that's from during the emergency itself, but such as volunteer firefighters or those who've worked to support the community in the recovery space. So a lot of key purposes that are utilised for anniversaries. Okay, from the practical point of view, when you're planning an event, it certainly can be easier to just consult with those people who are directly impacted, who've suffered physical losses. But for the benefit of your wider community and for others who definitely feel profoundly impacted by the emergency, if you can broaden that, it is really a valuable thing to do. And I think Shona touched on how important this is. So examples of the types of people who you may not immediately think of as being directly impacted are those who live near the disaster area but weren't directly impacted, so those potentially evacuated or know people who live in those communities. There are also people who have really strong connection to communities, particularly in regional areas. It may be that they holiday in the region every year, or it may be that they grew up there as a child, and potentially, particularly in the Black Summer context, it may be that there were people visiting those regions. So obviously it was a key time for tourism, that were there during the event and feel quite connected to that because of that experience of being involved in the emergency itself. There's also those volunteers who supported the event, and also other people who now work or volunteer in the recovery space. Their lives have changed dramatically, as I'm sure you're all aware, and so they are definitely impacted by that event, and being involved in the process of designing the anniversary can be incredibly beneficial for those people. And lastly, business owners who may not be directly impacted but live in the wider community and have been affected monetarily by the event. So if you are planning an event, it's really important that you consider and consult about who the event is for, who's going to attend, who are you going to invite if it's going to be a smaller event, who's going to speak or lead the commemoration if there is one. And if you can do that through consultation, you will end up with a much more inclusive event that satisfies a lot of your community. It's also important to consider, both through our communications and also the location of where we hold the event, that it tries to be inclusive and includes people in the event. For example, Shona mentioned that church services are often an important aspect of a anniversary celebration, but potentially if that's all that your community does, you may be excluding people who are non-religious or don't feel comfortable attending a church service. It also, you need to consider those who've had to relocate or maybe living outside the directly impacted area, and making sure that the timing and the nature of the event that you hold enables those people to attend. It's also important to prepare for the fact that a lot of post-disaster rituals such as anniversaries can trigger really strong emotions in your community, whether it's anger, stress, distress. It can be quite confronting for some people. And as people who work to support community in this space, we should definitely be prepared for that, and ensure that psychosocial support is available for those attending and also in the longer term post that event. So considering where events can be held is also really important. If a memorial has been established, this is obviously a key site for an anniversary event, but that may not have occurred yet. And the location can also be related to the emergency event itself. So we heard from Marie that the event in Yarloop was held on the Oval, where community members sheltered with firefighters during the fire. And was obviously an incredibly important location for that group of people. What's pictured here is an art installation that was established in the town of Northcliffe after a huge fire there in 2015. It was actually part of a wider art installation, so it wasn't established just as a result of the emergency. Rather, they took advantage, I suppose, of a pre-existing art installation that they call Understory, which is where artists from around the world come to Northcliffe and they connect community, creativity and nature in this nature walk, and they have art installations that are throughout the space. So a local artist created an installation for this Understory process, and it was called Rising from the Ashes. And basically 43 people from the local community were actually cast in charcoal, and this is people who lost property, members of the fire brigade, dairy farmers who fought the fires, and others who were really instrumental in supporting their community post that event. So each of the faces in the exhibition are unique and represent a local community member, and this was held as the place for the second anniversary event, where it was a very local event, and you know, each of the people that were pictured in these arts, it was sort of released to them and they were thanked for their contribution to the community. So a really local based, and it's quite stirring when you walk through this art installation, hunting for the faces that are, you know, in treetops and throughout the art installation. It's very empowering. Okay, so whether a formal event is held or not, the time of an anniversary can definitely be times when grief and bereavement resurfaces. And as we've talked about, both Shona and myself, the community and individual responses are incredibly diverse and varied. It can also trigger a new wave of people seeking support, some for the first time, so they may be brand new faces to you working in the recovery space. And I think this is based on their real reflection of the time passing, what it means for them, whether or not they feel that they are at the space that they thought they would be 12 months post this event. I think we are all understand that community has potentially at the beginning of an event a very false expectation of how quickly things will move and how quickly their lives will get back to normal if they do, and so they struggle with that and the fact that, you know, they're nowhere near where they thought they would be 12 months on. And it can create a space where people really do suffer from fatigue and, you know, question their ability to cope on their own. And so in the 6 months or so post these anniversaries and, you know, past the 12-month mark, you may well see a resurgence of people needing support, and particularly leading up to the anniversary, I think it's commonly quite a quiet time where people are really fatigued, but the anniversary can sometimes trigger people becoming more involved again. And lastly, the media can definitely have a huge impact on the anniversary and the memorial, and can have a strong influence. And sometimes this is a really positive influence and sometimes it's a negative influence. And I think there's some things that we can do as recovery workers and people in the community to try and make sure that media coverage is a positive. So obviously media can challenge people's privacy and result in individuals being exposed to images and stories that can re-trigger responses and emotional responses. But it can also, attention can also bring attention to the ongoing priorities and struggles of the community, and that awareness that, you know, a lot of people post-emergency feel that they've been forgotten, and I think that's particularly true in this COVID space, that COVID's sort of taken over the media, and so the ongoing struggles of our communities who've been fire affected potentially are not being as well covered as they would normally. And so anniversaries can be a trigger to reignite that. Communities can also have a really strong view on how they want the anniversary or the memorial represented to the broader community. And if the media change that focus or that intent to something that isn't what the community are hoping for, it can be quite negative for the community. So if you can talk to media, brief media, and be proactive in that space, you can actually encourage them to tell the story that your community wants to be told, and sometimes that is very effective by being proactive rather than being reactive. Obviously a lot of time commitment, once again, when people are incredibly busy, I know that it's a big call, but definitely positive. And I think there's also, certainly in the Black Summer kind of context, there's going to be quite a lot of inequity about how anniversaries are portrayed by the media. Some will be covered in great detail and others will be completely ignored by the media. So preparing your community for that is hopefully a key part of your communications moving towards the anniversary event, but also ensuring that those if you can get your local media at least to cover off your local event, it does at least acknowledge that that event is important to your community. All right, so just quickly, I thought I'd share a couple of examples of some of the events that I've been involved with in my experience. So this is the Margaret River bushfires. For those of you who may remember back to 2011, the unfortunate cause of this fire was an escaped government prescribed burn, and as a result there's quite significant anger in the community that was impacted. So the local community really wanted to turn that anger into a sort of reshape it towards being to regrowth and renewal rather than this focus on that negative. So they chose to hold their event in an area that was of significance to that community historically, but was also as in the part of the fire affected area. And symbolically they hung signs like this one, as well as fact elements of things that they had regained from their burnt properties, so charred pieces of property and that kind of thing, and they hung that from the tree. And then as part of the ceremony they replaced those artefacts with these birdhouses that were donated by artists, children and even people from the eastern states who wanted to represent the 47 properties that were lost and sort of represent the fact that people and nature would regrow post this fire. They then had a very low-key event where a local band and community were invited to just stay for a very low-key picnic, and people shared poems, stories, etc. If they wanted to. So that was a very community-driven part of the anniversary event, but then they also had a larger art installation and sort of the formal speeches and so on that community could opt into from the wider community. So this small community event was asked that no media be present, and they respected that wish, and then the media sort of focused on that larger, more broad community event, which enabled the community that was directly impacted to acknowledge the time passing in the way that they wanted to. This is the Parkerville Stoneville Mount Helena anniversary event from 1 year on. Once again, this was a community committee that primarily was made up of residents who were impacted or from the broader community, but also local community groups as well as some recovery agencies sitting on that committee. And it came through as a very strong theme that the thanks to people who were involved in the fires, volunteers and so on, they wanted to acknowledge in this event, but they also wanted to be connected to nature. So this is a very bush, community that were very strongly connected to nature. So the local art centre created this tree that you see out of sand. So they were obviously wanting something that was very transient, not a permanent memorial. And then they asked community members to write their thoughts on the leaves and cards that the art centre then collected and created a book of thoughts around the fire for sort of commemoration and to keep. So very symbolic kind of activity there, but it was partnered with an art exhibition, a barbecue with lots of entertainment for children, high school students performing a play that they'd created about the feeling of the community over the last year. And because of that nature focus for this community, it was very much around garden displays and regenerating bush. And there were some people in the community who found that the celebratory nature of this activity was quite difficult to understand, and they wanted a lot more of a solemn event. And it did create sort of two aspects of that community. One smaller group that thought that this kind of event was quite disrespectful and were quite emotive about that, and the majority of the community that really wanted to celebrate what made their community so special and the fact that they had, you know, hard-won progress in the last year and wanted to celebrate that as a group. So managing those two conflicting views was very, very difficult for the committee, particularly as they were made up of community members. And on the right there, you can see one of the memorials that was created. It's once again an extensive consultation process where the local community decided that they wanted 3 themes represented, and these sculptures were established on a nature trail that actually connects these three fire impacted communities together. One, they wanted their volunteers represented. The next, they wanted the connectivity and the support of the community represented. And then the final one was this nature and regeneration memorial. So 3 different aspects of their community recovery that was really important, but lots and lots of consultation around that. And lastly, I just wanted to represent the fact that obviously the need for anniversaries doesn't necessarily go away, and it can be quite long term. So last year was the 20th anniversary of Cyclone Vance, and this cyclone impacted the town of Exmouth quite significantly, and the local community drove this event, wanting to acknowledge that it had been 20 years past the cyclone. They were also feeling that their community had become quite complacent in their cyclone preparations, so they wanted to share their experiences so that the wider community could really learn from that experience and that the community could be more prepared for it. And so they held this event at the Ningaloo Centre, which sort of captures the history of the town of Exmouth, and obviously the story of Cyclone Vance is represented there. And they also had a social media element of it, because they acknowledged that many people who were involved directly in Cyclone Vance no longer lived in the area, so they wanted to be able to involve that wider group of people, and it was very well attended. And Red Cross volunteers actually attended this event and were so surprised at the emotion of people as they told their stories about what happened to them during this cyclone, as though it just happened yesterday. And this passion that the community had to really share their learnings so that the rest of the community could learn from that and potentially be more prepared should another event like that happen. So lots and lots of different aspects of that event. So there's obviously no need for you to have a commemorative event every year, and once again, very community driven in when the community want an event, and it can be, around the outcome of a legal proceeding. It can be something else that just triggers the need, and just be aware that it may be many years in the future that you are still working on these kinds of events. And lastly, just to sort of round up, I suppose, the tips that we've provided. So try and be as inclusive as possible, and events that encourage connectedness are usually the most successful and can be quite positive experiences for people. Really important to normalise the emotions and the feelings that come about as a result of anniversaries. If you can share wellbeing messages. Red Cross has some great wellbeing messages associated with anniversaries, and share those with your communities proactively so that they are prepared for the fact that it may actually impact them emotionally. Try and ensure that access is open to as many people as you possibly can, so that you really are encouraging that sense of solidarity and belonging in your community. Provide a really supportive environment, and think about providing some form of psychosocial support so that your community members can be supported and you're not relying on community itself too much in that space. Try and be respectful of everybody's different views, for both in relation to memorials and anniversaries. They can be very varied. Some people can almost appear to be quite irrational about some of these things, which can be very difficult to manage. So just try and be respectful and acknowledge everybody's truth as their own. If you can be as consultative as you can, I know that, time constraints, COVID, all sorts of different and hard pressures are on our time, but try to at least enable some form of feedback into this process. It really does empower your community to feel part of the process. And finally, make sure that recovery workers and people who are working to support these kinds of events are really well supported. So that opposition to some aspects of the event may be taken quite personally by your team and be quite difficult to manage the emotions that they are exposed to. So really focus on that self-care for your team and encourage them to seek support, talk about their experiences, and most importantly, not to internalise any of that negativity, because it's definitely about the role they're playing rather than them personally. So that's about it from me. So Shona, are there any questions?
Thanks, Karen.
No worries.
Great.
Second time around was great.
You were like smooth, like you'd practiced.
No, it's amazing.
So we've got about 10-15 minutes left, and so we're really happy to take questions, you know, provide some psychosocial support for our bizarre little interlude there of kicking you all out, quite traumatizing for everyone. Or yeah, so feel free to, you know, Jamie, people aren't sort of forced on mute, are they, with your host powers? Perhaps?
They're all forced on mute. They are.
Okay.
If I could suggest perhaps either typing it in the chat function is probably easy. Otherwise, just raise your hand in the actual app, in Zoom, and I can allow you to talk if you'd be so bold. While we're waiting for, oh, thanks heaps, Melinda. I guess while we're waiting for people to come through with their questions, it's just what struck me, Karen, that you were talking about just in your best practice and tips. It's also to acknowledge that disasters are a horrible experience to go through, horrible. And they're still horrible even when people are doing a really good job. So in council, and even when people are doing the best work. So your point about not taking things personally when community members are going through their own trauma, I think is a really critical point, is that, you know, just you're doing your best and it's just a horrible experience. No matter what you try to do, you can't take away that pain and trauma. Natalie just asks a question here. How do we access the wellbeing messages you mentioned that we could share during the anniversary times?
Natalie, what state are you in?
I might allow
New
Natalie
South
to.
Wales.
New South Wales.
So yeah, and what part of the state, you north or south? This is, should have asked that.
We're going to pinpoint
like
exactly where you are. That's right.
You don't have to share. We will. Oh, okay, great. So you may know, I think Karen, Karen, our recovery officer down there. But Jamie, maybe we'll send out a couple of things with the slides and the recording.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, Karen Akehurst is your main contact. Yeah. So we did also put out, I don't know if it went out with this, Jamie, but a couple of info sheets about anniversaries went out recently. But yeah, we'll send.
I'll include that show as a part of the further information. And I just want to spruik it as well, because we did a lot of work, is the Dr. Rob session that we recently held, which is it's not as a huge long webinar, but it does talk to, Dr. Rob is talking about anniversaries and what community members might be feeling as well. So I'll include that as a part of the mail out for everyone that's joined us in today's webinar. And just Jude's got a question here. Do you have a framework for community consultation for creation of an anniversary? Would you suggest doing this as a survey or once a small group has been put together and some draft ideas? Karen and Shona, throwing to you.
Go, Karen.
You want like a checklist or something, Jude? Something that's really easy, like I've done this, perhaps.
So we don't have a framework yet, but it's a great idea. I love it. So a project for Shona to undertake in her spare time. But certainly the surveys have been used in the past to, great extent. If you are having any community gatherings, as much possible notice as you can. But if you are sort of getting feedback from your community at all through those events, whether it be post-it notes on the wall or, a suggestion box in the back of the room, just pose the question, do you have any thoughts about what you might like to do to acknowledge the anniversary event? And as many of those community groups that you've got, seeking information, your networks, your conduits in the community, just access them and see whether there's any talk in the community, and then that sort of starts the process of what kind of framework that your community is thinking about. Certainly there is no one way to celebrate an anniversary, and some events are as simple as 2-minute silence for people who've died, through to, you know, grand events that have hundreds of attendees and take months to prepare. You know, there's just no rule book, and it really is so community driven that that consultation is really important.
Yeah. Jude, I'd say the Communicating and Recovery Guide could be useful. It's got some tips on building good feedback loops when you put out information. So, like, you know, encouraging people to kind of come back with information, but also ways of kind of mapping out and going back to that inclusive thing. So how to make sure you're kind of engaging with different groups in the community. So it could be useful. Also, the guidelines around temporary memorial management does have a checklist. It's about temporary memorials specifically, but there might be some useful things to kind of prompt you, and do certainly come back to us and say this was useless, trying to think of something better. Happy for feedback, but yeah. And also there is in my Churchill Fellowship a list of considerations. So as Karen was saying, you know, there's no hard and fast rules about this stuff. It is, you know, they're community-driven, community-led is really best practice, but that's hard because when you're kind of doing it, it doesn't give you a lot of, you're like, great, thanks, Shona, thanks, Karen, helpful.
Yeah. But another potential possibility is reach out to local governments or communities that have been impacted in the past. I know that, you know, Margaret Rivers shared their stuff with everybody. So there must be similar networks in Victoria, New South Wales, of communities that have been impacted before, and local governments tend to really want to share this hard work that you're all going through. So they share, you know, the surveys themselves and all that kind of thing. So if you can find a community that has similar values to yours, it may just be, you know, an easy fix.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, and it is, around kind of some considerations. I think
Barbara's got a question. Yeah,
really great question. Tips for best ways to conduct some needs assessment for managing a public memorial. That is a loaded question also. So recently managed a public memorial following the brutal death of a local woman on the Sunshine Coast. However, issues surfaced after the memorial was removed, attracting immediate attention despite this being well managed. I don't know what the issues are. I would say not surprising. You know, one of the things around, particularly with, and I'm just making some mind connections in my brain, I think I know what you are talking about, but you know, particularly with high profile deaths and murders and things like that, where there's, you know, malicious intent by other human beings, you know, they are always highly political. And I mean that, you know, not necessarily political party political, but just, you know, political, the regular sense of the word. So this is to be expected in some way. And I think in terms of needs assessment, it really depends on what it is you mean by that. If it's around what services you're going to be providing afterwards, it's really about getting out and talking to people before you do removal, and that's or moving of temporary memorials. And so that might be through having volunteers or other people providing psychosocial support at the event, like Karen was suggesting, and then kind of theming up the sentiment that they may be hearing from people. Because, you know, while we don't ever want to be breaking confidence of people when you're providing good psychosocial support, you do hear about what people's concerns are. And so often what we do, for example, when we do phone outreach, what we're doing a lot of at the moment, or door-to-door outreach, we kind of take a bit of a qualitative kind of report, I guess. We take a lot of qualitative data, and from that we're able to draw some kind of themes that come out, and you get a bit of a sense of what the feeling is in communities. You know, I'd be really interested in talking to you about this more, because that would then get a bit of a feel of what's going on, which can kind of help you. But at the same time, sometimes the media talks to a number of noisy people, and the issues may not be are really deep-seated in the community. They may just be one or two people with an opinion. So I'm not sure what the kind of issues are, but you know, it's case by case again. So I'm not sure how helpful that was, but a really interesting question, and would be really keen to hear more about that. Understanding the needs of contributed to them. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, yeah. And that's a hard one, right? Because how do you, you know, it's not like when people contribute to these temporary kind of very ephemeral type things that you take a register of people. But it is something I kind of touch on a bit in my Churchill Fellowship, where people feel a sense of ownership of temporary memorials when they contribute to them. So, and that's why when we talk about broad consultation, we're not talking about, particularly with temporary memorials, where also in that sense, we're also not talking about just those affected, because temporary memorials are being a little bit different to kind of geographic events, often occur at a site of death, at a site of the event. Permanent memorials do, but the initial kind of emotive gathering is often at the site. And it means that, and these are events where, say, you know, for example, with the murder here on the Sunshine Coast, or, you know, the Sydney siege here in Sydney, Burke Street, these kinds of things where people don't necessarily like live in the location. Some people do, they are part of the affected community, but so are people who, you know, went to the Link Cafe every day for their coffee but didn't happen to be there on the day. They feel affected. So do people who walked past every day. So do people that had some prior traumatic experience that this is sort of re-triggered. So that kind of affected group is very broad and diverse, and that's where that kind of you know, understanding the needs of that group of people, particularly around communicating the removal, is really challenging. And there's ways in which you can engage the media a bit to sort of say, look, this is what we're going to do. But, you know, I think also expecting some division and differing of opinions is also, yeah, you're just going to have to really. Sorry, that was a ramble. Very interesting question. Anything else? Jane, we're probably almost on time.
We are. Very good. Any other questions before we wrap up, folks? I'm very cognizant that it's been nearly 2 hours of your time with a little blip at the end there in the middle of our session with Karen. So any other questions at all before we wrap up? No? Going once? Well, if that's the case, I wanted to thank you so much again for joining us for our webinar, the first part, and then the break, and then the second part. We hope you've enjoyed today's session, and a special thanks obviously to Karen Edmeades and Shona Whitton for their time today and providing us with some of their insight and experience. Just a reminder that this webinar was recorded, and what we'll do is actually send you a link to the recording along with all the resources that Karen and Shona mentioned today, plus others, as well as just a bit of a survey to help us improve our content and delivery. Maybe we won't have such a long tea break next time. But if you are on LinkedIn, I would encourage you to join us over at the Disaster Recovery Practitioners Australia group on LinkedIn, just to continue the conversation. Now, the purpose of that group is to share information about the practice of disaster recovery for community members, local governments, local organisations, schools, businesses, among others. There are many people who are going to be facing being a recovery manager for the first time, even if disaster recovery is nowhere near their job title. The Australian Red Cross, I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't plug my own project. The Red Cross also runs the Disaster Recovery Mentors Australia program, which is a program aimed at supporting community members and communities impacted by disaster to drive their own recovery. Now, what we do is we link volunteer trained mentors such as Anne Leadbeater, Steve Pascoe, amongst others, who have previous personal experience in disaster recovery, and we link them with community workers and leaders currently in the midst of recovery and address the challenges posed by the disaster recovery process. So the mentoring actually aims to help communities avoid unnecessary pitfalls in recovery, help normalise the recovery experience and share their experiences, provide support and act as a sounding board. Now, if you are interested in the program, please email us over at recovery@redcross.org.au. As we mentioned all the time, this is one of a series of webinars over at the Red Cross YouTube channel, Disaster Recovery Webinars. So please keep an eye on the Red Cross website for upcoming ones. Thank you so much again for joining us, for your patience, your understanding and your kindness. Until next webinar, take care and goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for hosting, Jamie. Stella.